Good afternoon, all, and welcome to Top Tips for Your GP Practice Premises. This has been put on in conjunction with our health partnership. So, thank you ever so much for joining. I apologise for not joining you live. This is just a recording of the presentation due to terrible organisation skills and we're not realising that it was the school holidays this week here in Yorkshire. So my apologies. So you've got a virtual version of me today. I hope that's okay. My name's Will Ellis, by the way. So I am one of the managing directors here at BW Healthcare Surveyors, and I'll be running through the presentation and the webinar for you today. So let's begin. So what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll briefly explain to you who we are as an organisation, who BW Healthcare Surveyors are, in case you haven't joined one of these webinars previously. We're then going to be talking about the premises cost directions, which are now 18 months old. So some of the key changes to the premises cost directions and how we've seen them affect our clients over the last few months. We'll then delve deeply into notional rent. So those of you who are in an owner-occupied practice, be very useful to listen how notional rent works and how you can potentially maximise your rental income through notional rent as well. And then we'll be talking about your GP surgery leases. So for those of you who aren't in owner-occupied practices, for those of you who are in leasehold premises, be an interesting slide as to things to look out for within your lease when your rent reviews are due and your lease renewals are due and things as well. And then finally, I'll just briefly touch on a free premises health check that we are offering all practices within our health partnership at the moment, and all practices in the UK, in fact. So yeah, some of the things that we offer for free, so you can give us a call and perhaps utilise some free advice following this webinar. Okay, so very briefly, who are BW Health HS? So that is BW Healthcare Surveyors. So ultimately, we offer help and support to GP practices all over the UK for all their premises related matters, from notional rent reviews or challenging notional rent reviews to assisting through lease rent reviews when the landlord instigates reviews, or lease renewals. We do market valuations for partnership changes. We also do pharmacy rent reviews and also sale and lease back as well. So if you're interested in selling the premises and leasing it back, we can assist you through anything premises related, basically. We have already assisted over 1,500 GP practices. It's actually closer to 2,000 now since the company was launched in 2017, and we are #1 ranked specialist primary care surveying firm in the UK with over 150. Again, I think it's closer to 175 5-star reviews now as well on Practice Index, which is effectively Trustpilot for primary care organisations. And we've got 8 specialist primary care surveyors here. So this is all we do on a daily basis, is help practices with the wide variety of premises related matters, as mentioned previously. So our surveyors, between them, have around 100 years combined experience with helping practices. They've helped thousands of practices over the years. So yeah, we'd like to think that we know what we're talking about when it comes to primary care premises. Okay, so that's enough about BW Healthcare Surveyors. Let's go on to the actual webinar itself. So the first slide is going to be about the 2024 premises cost directions, which seems like a dated thing to talk about, but I just wanted to talk about it from a reality point of view, really, to see how it's actually affecting practices. Yes, they've been in place for 18 months now, but we're actually starting to understand how ICBs are treating the premises cost directions. So we've got a far better idea of how they're actually working in real time. The 2024 obviously replaced the 2013 premises cost directions, and for those of you who aren't aware what the premises cost directions are, it is effectively directions that govern how GP practices are reimbursed for their rent, and how they are how rent reviews and things like that happen through the process. So just all reimbursement to do with premises is governed by the premises cost directions. And there's some key changes between the 2013 and the 2024. Some of you might already be aware of some of the changes, especially those in leasehold premises, which we'll get to in a moment or two. But yeah, so the biggest change, as I've said, is the change in the lease rent review process. So for those of you who are in leasehold practices. You will potentially be fully aware that what used to happen when you had a rent review was the landlord would instigate the rent review, you'd pass it to the ICB had instructed the district valuer, and you just sit back and wait for the landlord and the district valuers to fight it out between themselves. You'd hopefully have a clause in the lease that says you're going to get fully reimbursed, and you'd have nothing to do with that process. Somebody in their wisdom up at NHS England decided that that was a far too easy process, far too simple, and they'd like to complicate matters and make it difficult for GP practices for whatever reason. But that seems to be what's happened. So what's happened now is there's an extra layer of that process. So now the landlord will instigate a rent review, but rather than you just passing that to the ICB and forgetting about it, you've now got to negotiate with the landlord yourselves to make sure what the landlord is proposing is correct and in line with the current market. Now, obviously, unless you've got a surveyor working at the practice, you probably can't do that yourselves. So you're going to have to instruct companies like ourselves to assist you through the process. So it's great for us because we get a whole load of instructions that we never used to get before, but not really great for you as GP practices because it means you're paying for services that, in all honesty, you don't really need and you shouldn't have to. But that is the process. That's what it says in the premises cost directions. There's not really much you can do about it. There's some ICBs that are very happy with you just sending a couple of emails to the landlord and just showing that you've at least tried to negotiate without having to instruct surveying firms. There's other ICBs that want you to outline detailed negotiations and things. So what I would say is if you have a rent review from the landlord, in the first instance, just pass it to the ICB and see how they're going to treat that. They may just be happy with instructing the district valuer. They may decide and may ask you to instruct your own surveyor, at which point you can then contact your preferred surveying firm to assist you through the process. Okay, so the next one is the 12-week deadline to challenge and accept rent assessments. So again, this is a relatively new process. So when you have a rent review, either a lease rent review from when you're in a leasehold premises, or a notional rent review for your owner occupied practice, once you receive that CMR form from the NHS, you've now only got 12 weeks to either accept it or decline it, which is a brand new deadline. There was fears that if you didn't respond within that 12-week deadline, it was classed as automatic acceptance. That is not the case. You've technically got 3 years to instigate an appeal. That hasn't changed. We have challenged an awful lot of rent reviews outside of that 12-week deadline. As long as you don't reply accepting the proposal, then you can still instigate the process. I think the 12-week deadline really is just an internal process from the ICB, so they can just pop it into their completed file and forget about it until further notice. It's still probably advisable to try and keep within that 12-week deadline. Like I said, we have instigated a lot of rent reviews outside of that 12-week period, but it's a little bit tricky at times and it just delays the process. So if you can stick to that 12-week deadline, it is ideal. So what I would say is as soon as you receive that CMR4, if you're in a leasehold premises, or CMR6 if you're in an owner-occupied practice, is just send it off to, again, your preferred surveying firm who can check it, make sure it's correct, make sure you're not getting underfunded, make sure the rent that's being proposed is correct and in line with the current market. The next one is to do with improvement grants and the funding cap. So previously, if you've ever applied for a grant from the NHS for an extension or improvements, there used to be a maximum amount that you could get from that grant, and it used to be 66%. So if the improvement works you were doing were costing 100,000, the grant could only be a total of £66,000. You'd have to find that 34%, that £34,000 yourselves. You'd have to self-fund that as a practice. That cap has now been removed. So now the ICBs have the capability of offering 100% grants. Now, what I would say is just because they can offer 100% grants does not mean they are going to. That doesn't mean every grant will be 100%. It just means it gives them the capability of offering 100% where necessary, which is a good move, but this still doesn't resolve the issues of funding within the ICBs, or lack of funding within the ICBs, and financial issues that most ICBs seem to be running into at the moment. So it is a good step. It's a forward step, but in reality, are we seeing many 100% improvement grants? Not really. They are around. I know a couple of our clients have got them, but it is very, very tricky getting grant money. But a positive step either way, and at some point, hopefully, they'll start dishing out these 100% improvement grants on a more frequent basis. Okay, the next point is leases required if all partners have retired. So this should have always been the case anyway, that yes, it's now in the premises cost direction, so it is a requirement rather than a mere suggestion. But what this means is if all the owners of the practice have now retired and there's no partner at the practice that owns a share in the premises, you need to be putting a lease in place. It is a requirement for you to have a lease in place. What I would say from my experience is even if there's one partner who no longer who doesn't own the premises, or there's an ex-partner who's now left but still owns the premises, you really want to be considering putting a lease in place. You won't necessarily need to put a lease in place, but I would certainly seek professional advice to see if it is advisable to put a lease in place. You may at times just be able to amend your partnership agreement. So rather than actually putting a lease in place, you may just be able to make changes to your partnership agreement to cover things like repairs and maintenance, and things like that, which is always a big dispute when something goes wrong. If there's a leak in the roof, who's going to be responsible for it? Who actually has to pay for it? Now, if there are partners that some own the premises and some don't, and some have retired and are no longer actually practicing the premises, then it can cause issues on who's actually going to be paying for that. So it's important that is documented somewhere, ideally in a lease or at worst case a partnership agreement. But like I said, if all partners have retired and there's not a single partner who owns a share in the premises, you are now required to put a lease in place. So again, if that is the case, contact your preferred surveying firm or your preferred solicitors, and they can talk you through the process and talk about costs and fees and things for assisting you through that process. Okay, so that's the premises cost directions. There are actually quite a few other changes that have gone on in the premises cost directions. It's quite a large document, to be honest with you. We've put quite a detailed analysis of the differences between the 2013 and the 2024 premises cost directions on our website. So you can go onto our website at some point. You'll be able to find that in our news news and blogs section on our website. But equally, if you just type it into Google, if you type in something like the difference between the 2013 premises cost directions and the 2024 premises cost directions, you'll probably stumble across a lot of blogs. There's a lot of surveying firms, there's a lot of solicitors who've written blogs about the changes in the premises cost directions. So there's loads of information that you can find out if you want to delve a little bit deeper into those changes. Okay, so the next slide is all about notional rent. So those of practices who are in owner-occupied premises, probably a good time to listen up. Those who are in leasehold premises might even be a good time to go and get yourselves a cup of tea. But certainly, if you're in an owner-occupied premises, this slide is certainly for you. So notional rent, as I'm sure you're aware, if you're in owner-occupied premises, is the reimbursement that you receive from the NHS, the notional rent, the rent that you receive from the NHS for occupying the premises, for owning the premises. The NHS pay you a rent as technically they are tenants. So that rent is reviewed every 3 years. That rent is reviewed by the ICB, by the district valuer, and you will have an opportunity to challenge that review. And it is, I would say, essential that you do so, because 89% of practices in the UK are underfunded for their notional rent reimbursement. That is information that we have gained through our own experience. So we do around 400 rent reviews a year, undertake around 400 notional rent challenges a year, and around 89% of practices that we undertake challenges for are underfunded. So that means that could be as little as £100, could be as much as £50,000 a year. But nearly 9 out of 10 practices are getting underfunded for their notional rent. So if you're a practice that just accepts that every year or every 3 years and just assumes that the RCB's proposal and the district valuer's proposal is in line with the current market, there's a good chance that it probably isn't, and you're actually getting underfunded. So really, really important that you look at challenging those reviews when they come in. It can be quite a lengthy process, the notional rent review process. So the reviews are due every 3 years, but they're very rarely done on time. There's practices that are sometimes 3, 4, 5 years overdue. But there are things you can do to speed that process up. The biggest thing is probably just to regularly chase the NHS. The amount of times the NHS just forget that you're due a review or won't be aware that you're due a review. They'll get around to it eventually, but like I said, that could be 2-3 years down the line. But if you know when your rent review process is, or when your rent review is due, then just ping them a quick email and say, look, we're due a review in November. Can you send us the CMR1 forms, which is the first stage of the process, a set of forms that you need to fill in, but they'll come from the NHS. And if you do request then CMR1 forms, what always happens when the ICB send out the forms, they'll send you some blank forms to fill in from scratch. However, you'll have filled those exact same forms in 3 years ago, and there's probably not much that has changed at the practice over that 3-year period. So what you could do is, if you've still got access to those forms, you could just update the old forms, amend them, make sure you add any changes that you've made, and then just send those off to the ICB. If you don't have a copy yourself, the ICB should hold a copy, so just send them an email, and again, just request a copy of the previously submitted forms. They're not overly complicated, the forms, but they can be quite time consuming filling them in. So it'll just save you a whole host of time if you can get hold of the previously submitted forms and just update and amend them rather than filling them in from scratch every 3 years. Number 3 is never just accept the district valuer's proposal. As I said at the start of this, it is so important that you get a second opinion. And I'm not just saying that because we're a surveying firm that offer that service. Even if you don't use ourselves, there are plenty of other surveying firms. Just get a second opinion from somebody. There are so many surveying firms out there. From our point of view, and I'm sure for other surveying firms as well, we actually offer a free initial assessment. So if you send us through your district valuer's proposal, your CMR6 form, we can check it free of charge to let you know, yeah, that looks about right, or no, that looks like you're underfunded, it's worth further investigation. And that initial assessment is free of charge, and there's no obligation to proceed. So I would certainly suggest at least going to that stage to see if what has been proposed looks thereabouts right, or whether it does look like you are underfunded. But equally, I would always advise getting a challenge. And even if you've challenged 3 years ago, I would challenge every 3 years. Just check it and make sure it's not going to cost you anything. Like I said, the majority of surveying firms work on a performance-related basis, which means you'll only pay us if we're successful in getting you an increase. So you have nothing to lose in getting a second opinion and getting a surveying firm to challenge that assessment, because worst case scenario, you just stay on the same rent as what's been offered. Best case scenario, you could be 5, 6, 7, 10, 20,000 pounds underfunded a year. So always get a second opinion. Also, just be aware of notional rent abatements. So one of the biggest things that we see when we're challenging notional rent is that the abatement calculations are incorrect. And an abatement would be applied if, for instance, you've built an extension, but you received grant money from the ICB. So if you received money from the ICB to build an extension, the ICB have let's say they give you a 50% grant. They've paid for 50% of the extension. What they're not then going to do is reimburse you for the whole of that extension. What they'll say is, well, we paid for half of that extension, we're only going to reimburse you for half of that extension for a period of time. That might be 5, 10, 15 years. And it's effectively your way of paying back that grant money. Effectively, it's effectively a loan, and you pay it back because your rent is abated for that period of time. But what a lot of practices aren't aware, let's say you received a 50% grant for your extension. That extension cost £100,000. It's increased the rent by £10,000, let's say. So because you've received a 50% grant for that, you're not going to receive the full rent at £10,000. You're only going to receive 50% of it, £5,000. However, you do actually get an additional 10% on top of that, so you should actually receive £6,000 in those circumstances. And a lot of practices aren't receiving that additional 10%, or a lot of practices, the actual abatement calculation and the percentage of what the grant was compared to what you put in is incorrect. So again, always check your abatement calculations, and again, your preferred surveying firm should be able to assist you with that. If you are thinking about improvements or extensions, it is extremely important that you get approval for reimbursement of those improvements and reimbursement of that extension. The amount of practices, and I would say it doesn't happen as much now, but certainly a few years ago, the amount of practices that just built an extension themselves and assumed that they'd get reimbursement for it is frightening. And the thing is, the premises cost directions actually specifically state that you can't get retrospective approval. So if you've built an extension just assuming you're going to get rent for it, the chances are you're never going to receive rent for it. What you need to do is, before you even start building, as part of your due diligence at the start, is, even if you're getting grant money from the NHS, just receiving grant money doesn't automatically mean you're going to get reimbursement. Just send them a specific email saying, can you confirm we're going to receive reimbursement for these improvements for that extension? So get it explicitly in writing that they have approved reimbursement of the improvements or of the extension. Okay, sticking to owner-occupied practices. So how to maximize the value of the premises, or how to maximize the rental income more, because increasing the rental income is automatically going to increase the value of the premises. When you increase your rental income, even by as little as £1,000 a year, it could increase the value of the premises by 10, sometimes 15, even a little bit more, £15,000 a year. So a £1,000 increase in rental income could increase the value of the premises by up to £15,000, maybe even a little bit more. So it can make a huge difference to the value of the premises, even small increases in rent. And the best way to increase your rental income is, again, sounds like I'm beating a drum, but again, is to get your notional rent checked by an independent surveyor. Just have it checked to make sure what you're receiving is correct and in line with the current market. Other ways, though, is ensuring your lease agreements and rental amounts are up to date. So if you rent any space out to a pharmacy or a dentist or an alternative therapist, just make sure that the rent they're paying, again, is in line with the current market. If you've got leases in place, make sure that there's no outstanding rent reviews. If there are, look at instigating those rent reviews and proposing an increase. Perhaps the lease is expired, then you certainly need to look at renewing that lease. Perhaps you rent space out to somebody and there isn't a lease in place, then you need to be looking at putting a lease in place, because actually the value of that rental income without a lease is basically zero, because there's no guarantee that that rental income will continue. So from an investor point of view, an investor is going to come in and purchase the premises. They're going to say, great, you're renting out to a pharmacy. That pharmacy pays £20,000 a year. Brilliant. But there's no lease in place. So that pharmacy could just leave tomorrow. I could buy the practice and that pharmacy could leave tomorrow. So there's no guarantee from an investor point of view. So if somebody's renting space from you, very, very important that you put a lease in place, and ideally a long-term lease. The longer the lease, the more it's going to increase the value of the premises. So because that rent is guaranteed for a longer period of time. If you've got a 5-year lease, it'll increase it by X amounts. But if you can increase that lease to 10 years, then it's going to increase it by an awful lot more. So the length of the lease is important as well. Absolutely have a lease in place. And if all you can get is a 12-month rolling lease, fine. But ideally, you want to be looking at, I would say, at least 10 years is the normal length to really maximize the value of the premises. The next point is make the most out of any spare space. I appreciate no one's got any spare space, but if you do manage to magic some spare space from somewhere, it's just making sure that that space is either reimbursed for notional rent. So perhaps seek approval from the ICB to see if they will reimburse you notional rent for that space, or if not, then look at renting that space out to, like I said, an alternative therapist, whoever that may be. And if there are non-reimbursable areas in the premises as well, you really want to be maximizing the whole of the premises. And again, that's why it's important to get a surveyor to check your notional rent, because what they'll do is they'll highlight any areas of the premises that you're not actually receiving notional rent for. And sometimes it can be quite significant. We've had practices before. There was one a few years ago down south who were using 2 floors, and the ICB were only ever reimbursing them for 1 floor, and they weren't even aware. This was going on for years and years. And we went to the ICB and said, look, the practice is clearly using 2 floors. You need to reimburse them for both floors. And their rent doubled. It doubled that review. So that's obviously an extreme example, but there's loads of examples where rooms have been missing, rooms haven't been reimbursed, or the wrong number of car parking spaces. So again, just making sure that you're aware of what you're actually getting reimbursed for, what rooms you're getting reimbursed for, how many car parking spaces you're getting reimbursed for, because that can help increase the rent and then increase the value of the premises as well. And then upgrades and improvements to the surgery as well. Obviously, if you're going to be modernizing the premises or extending the premises, again, as long as you've had approval from the NHS, from the ICB, then you will receive reimbursement for that space as well. So upgrades and improvements are always a very good way of maximizing the value of the premises. And then obviously, yeah, that says exploring the possibility of extensions. So I've skipped that bit. I've put those two together, upgrades and extensions all in one go. Okay, so that's owner-occupied practices. So your owner-occupied practices and your leasehold premises can switch around now. So those in leasehold premises, you might want to listen up. Those in owner-occupied premises, time for a cup of tea probably. Unless, of course, you're thinking about becoming a leasehold premises, you're thinking about putting the lease in place, and then you might want to put the cup of tea on hold until the end of the webinar. I'll leave it entirely up to yourselves. Okay, so from a lease perspective, when you're putting a lease in place, or if you have an existing lease, there are a few health warnings for both tenants and landlords to consider. The biggest one is just to make sure you've got a specific NHS GP surgery lease. Now, you might not know that by looking at it, but again, that's where a specialist surveyor or a specialist solicitor can come in and have a look and just make sure. And it has to be a specific NHS GP surgery lease, because unlike a standard commercial lease, which is actually just between a landlord and a tenant, when you're in an NHS GP surgery, there's a third entity involved, the NHS themselves, the ICB. And the ICBs, the NHS, will have a very significant role in things like the rent review and the lease renewal and the approvals of leases. So that has to be stipulated within the lease what their role is. And if you've just gone and pulled a commercial lease off the internet, or used a surveying firm or solicitors but don't perhaps have experience in primary care, you might not have the correct provisions within the lease to protect you when it comes to the rent reviews. So extremely important that you use a specific NHS GP surgery lease and not just a stock commercial lease off the internet. Always get approval when it comes to your lease from the NHS, from the district valuers as well. So when you're going through a lease renewal, or when you're putting a lease in place, you'll have a set of heads of terms, so like key terms for the lease, the length of the lease, what the repair and maintenance obligations are, and you'll be agreeing what those are between the landlord and tenant, and you'll reach an agreement. But before the lease is signed, those provisional terms, that provisional agreement needs to go to the NHS and the ICB just to make sure that they're happy with it. And then they'll undertake a value for money report effectively, because they'll be reimbursing you the rent for the duration of the lease. So they need to make sure it's value for money from their point of view as well. Extremely important that you go through that process and you have that lease approved, because without an approved lease, the NHS don't actually have to reimburse you rent at all. So they could just stop reimbursement. I'll be honest and say I've never known that happen, but it could happen. And what will happen is, if you have a lease that hasn't been approved by the ICB, and 5 years after signing it, you decide to sell the premises, you're not going to find an investor that wants to purchase the premises without an approved lease. So it's just far easier and extremely important that you get that lease approved by the NHS. And some of the things that you want to be checking for within the lease is just to make sure that you've got the necessary protections in the lease. So make sure you've got protections in the lease that perhaps, that from a rent review perspective, that protect you from the rents, protect you from paying more to the landlord than what you're receiving. So there should be a clause in the lease that says the rent you pay the landlord cannot exceed what you're getting reimbursed by the NHS. Very, very important that you have that clause, because it means the landlord can never charge you more without it getting approved and ratified by the NHS. So make sure you've got the necessary protections. You should also have protections at the end of the lease as well. Ideally, you'll be within the Landlord and Tenants Act, which effectively stops the landlord from just kicking you out at the end of the lease. You as tenants will have an automatic right to renew the lease at the end of term. And at least it makes it very difficult for the landlord, not impossible, but very difficult for the landlord to just decide to kick you out and get somebody else in. Also, you want to be checking your obligations within the lease, so what your repair and maintenance obligations are, and whether you actually can retain any rent from the NHS. So when it comes to repair and maintenance, which is always a sticky point when it comes to leases, one of the biggest reasons why leases are disputed is who's going to be responsible for the repair and maintenance. Now, as standard, it should be the landlord's responsibility for the external repair and maintenance, and the tenant's responsibility for the internal repair and maintenance. That is standard. Now, if you deviate from what is standard, then there has to be allowances in the lease. The landlord's never going to take on the responsibility of the internal repair and maintenance. However, it is quite common for the tenants to take on responsibility for the external repair. So take on the responsibility of something that should be the landlord's responsibility. Now, if you're in a practice that is responsible for everything, both internal and external, we call that an FRI lease, a full repair and insurance lease, then you should be retaining a proportion of the rent that you receive from the NHS. So rather than receiving the rent from the NHS and just paying that in full to the landlord, which is standard, you should retain somewhere between 5 and 7.5% of the rent. And the idea is you put that rent into a sinking fund and you use that to pay for any repairs and maintenance that's needed for the external part of the building. Because what shouldn't happen is, yes, you're taking on responsibility from the landlord, but that shouldn't penalize you financially. So either A, the landlord takes on the responsibility of the external repair and maintenance, great, or B, you're responsible, but you've got that retention there to fund any repairs and maintenance that's needed. Also, when you're in a leasehold premises, it might be worthwhile considering a lease re-gear prior to the expiry of the lease. Now, when the lease expires, you can instigate a renewal 12 months before. But what might be worthwhile considering, if you're around 4 or 5 years to expiry, so perhaps you signed a 25-year lease and there's 4 or 5 years left to run, it might be worthwhile exploring a lease re-gear, which is effectively renewing the lease early. Now, the benefit of that to you is quite often landlords are willing to pay you a premium for that. So they'll pay you a lump sum for it. They might even build you an extension or improve the surgeries. Very, very common. Certainly for the bigger landlords, very, very common to do that. And the reason why they're happy to do that is because by increasing the length of the lease, as I mentioned in the last slide, significantly increases the value of the premises. So it increases their investment. So if they've got you're in a practice, there's only 5 years left to run, there's a worry there from an investor point of view that you could just move out in 5 years. So what they're going to be very interested in doing is tying you down for another 20, 25 years, and they'll just give you a lump sum to do that. And it can generally sometimes be hundreds of thousands of pounds, depending on the value of the rent, depending on the rental income and the value of the surgery. Can be an awful lot of money. Now, the landlord isn't obligated to renew early. There's no, you can't force them to do that, but it is worth having that conversation with them, especially if you're running out of space, especially if you're in need of improvements. It's extremely worthwhile just having that conversation with them to say, look, I know the lease has got 5 years left to run. However, we're running out of space. We're thinking about building an extension. Why don't we sign a lease, another 25-year lease, and you build as an extension, and just open up those negotiations? Certainly worth considering if any of you are in a practice that is nearing the expiry of the lease. Okay, that is pretty much it for me, to be honest with you. You can all go and get a cup of tea in a moment or two. Let me just run through a couple of things that we can offer yourselves following this phone call. So the free premises health check that we offer, which is effectively an initial conversation with all practices. So if you've got an issue with your premises, you've got a rent review coming up or a lease renewal coming up, or you're thinking about doing some improvements, you've got a partner retiring, think about selling the premises, whatever it may be, anything premises related, just pick up the phone to us. We'll have a conversation with you. We'll advise on what the best next steps are. We'll advise on things you need to think about, things you don't need to think about, the pitfalls, the pros, the cons of, and things like that. We'll even potentially suggest other specialist organizations, whether that be accountants or architects or solicitors. And we can do that all in that free initial consultation over the phone. And following that, we might decide to offer you another free service. So one of the things that we offer for free, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is our free notional rent reimbursement check. So if you're due a notional rent review, or you're not sure when your next notional rent review is due, send us a copy of the district values assessment that you've just received, or a historic district values assessment, and we can check that free of charge. We can advise whether the rent is correct in line with the current market. We can advise on when your next rent reviews are and things like that. We can also do that for surgery leases. So again, if you're in a leasehold premises, perhaps like we've talked about earlier, when it comes to repair and maintenance, perhaps you don't know whether you're responsible for the internal or the external repair. Perhaps you aren't aware whether you're eligible for a retention of rent. Send us through a copy of your lease and we can advise on when your lease renewals are due, when your rent reviews are due, make sure you've got the necessary protections in the lease, advise on what your repair and maintenance obligations are as well. So we can do that all for you free of charge. And equally, we can do that for pharmacy leases as well. So if you rent out space to not just a pharmacy, but if you rent out space to a dentist, an opticians, district nurses, whatever it is, If you've got a lease in place with that organization, we can check that lease. Again, advise on what the next rent reviews are, the lease renewal. We can check the rent as well, especially if in a pharmacy. If it's a pharmacy, we can actually do a very detailed desktop assessment of the pharmacy rent to advise exactly where it should be and whether it's in line with the current market or not. We can do that quite often without visiting an extremely detailed assessment of the pharmacy lease. So any sort of leases you want us to check, any sort of rent reviews, rent review notices, perhaps you've received a rent review notice from the landlord, we can advise on what the next best steps are from that point of view as well. So basically anything premises related, what we like to say is we can either deal with it ourselves, and if we can't, we'll certainly know an organization who will be able to help. So yeah, as I've said, leave you with some final thoughts and then I'll leave you to your afternoons. I would say whatever you're going through from a premises related matter, it is imperative that you get the correct advice from specialist organizations. Sometimes we're not the cheapest. You can probably get it cheaper on the high street, but it's such a niche sector. It's so specialist that by not using specialist surveyors or specialist accountants or specialist solicitors, architects, whatever it may be, it's going to cost you so much more in the long run. So I would say it's imperative that you seek out specialist organizations. We can recommend specialist accountants and solicitors and architects and even energy companies, all sorts of different organizations we can recommend to you. So again, just very, very important that you get specialist advice, whatever it is you're planning in the future. Okay, that is it for me. What we would normally do at this stage is have a bit of a Q&A. Obviously, this isn't live. I'm not really here. I'm on a beach in Whitby, hopefully at some point. Hopefully it's not too cold. But yes, so if you do want to get in touch, you can probably get in touch via our health partnership, so send them an email. But equally, my telephone number is there. That's actually my direct line. My email address is there as well. And then there's a copy of our website. We've got an online form to fill in. Online contact us page, so you can contact us on the website, send me an email, give me a call, and we can set up a free consultation. We can talk about your exact circumstances and any questions or queries that you might have following this webinar. So that is it from me. Again, my sincere apologies for not being here live. Hopefully next time I will be here in real life. But if you've got any other follow-up questions or queries, please let me know. Thank you ever so much for our health partnership for putting this together and allowing me the time to talk to all you lovely people. Have a great afternoon and a great week, and I'll hopefully speak to you all very, very soon.